we're only going to go through a few of these verses, probably chapter 19, 1 through 5 tonight, because there is so much in this, and I'm going to just preference this with, we've been studying Elijah, phenomenal man, phenomenal prophet, phenomenal man of God. He is a man of courage. Look where he has been, from the widow, from feeding them, to calling out the drought, to approaching the king, Ahab, with no issues, no problem. Then going to Mount Carmel, and we studied last week, the fire from heaven coming down, and obviously our God won, and he went. And the last thing we understood is that when after he went and basically killed all the prophets of Baal, which was Jezreel's men, they had a race. And we saw in the end of chapter 18 how when the Lord came upon Elijah in the very end, and he girded up his loins and ran ahead of Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel, 12-mile run. He ran faster, harder than the horses and the chariots could, and he beat him there. And so we ended with a great idea, great thought, realizing that, listen, when God moves you to do something and he empowers you to do it, you're going to do it better than you ever thought you could. When God's in it, it's going to work. And so it was a great ending of that. And in chapter 19, we're going to see a little bit different side of Elijah. Because when you really understand this, something happened. Because when you see how Elijah responded to the realities of his calling in the previous chapters, man, he was a man of valor. He was a man of no fear. And then all of a sudden, something changed. And we need to realize what that something is, because that something that changed for Elijah, I believe, is something that changes you and I on our thriving and surviving our spiritual life. And I think it's very important in our lives. I know I've faced it, and I face it every now and then, and I'm sure most of us face it. But I guess if I could put it into perspective, it's a spiritual depression. There's literally a term, spiritual depression. And I think this is where we find Elijah. And I think many Christians, many pastors, many full-time ministries, many individuals come a point in their life where they're just spiritually depressed. They're burnt out, nothing left to give, and all those things. And listen, I was there. I've been there, done that. And it's not a pretty place to be. In fact, it's a shameful place to be now as I stand here in front of you, knowing that I allowed myself to get that deep, allowed myself to go that low. And so a lot of ripples I'm still dealing with 20-some years later because I allowed that moment to happen in my life. And so we're coming to a point, and I think it's important to realize because when we see what happened to him, we also understand. In fact, D. Martin, I think it's Lloyd Jones, wrote a book literally called Spiritual Depression. And if you ever get a hold of that, go to Amazon, get a hold of that book. It's a phenomenal read. And I think it's important that we understand that about this spiritual depression that he goes through. Because when we look into this chapter, verse 1 of chapter 19, it says, "And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, also how he had executed all the prophets with the sword." Now again, we know that Ahab was the king of the 10 northern tribes. And so Jezebel, he married, and we know what that name means. It's not a good person. It's not a good name. This lady, this woman created much fear, obviously. But look what Elijah just did. He stood all day on Mount Carmel. Not only I think he had a spiritual depression, but he also had a physical fatigue. He stood all day on Mount Carmel. God moved him to run 12 miles faster than the horse. And he gets there to where they're at now, and into Jezreel. And he's waiting there, nothing going on. We understand that King Ahab then told his wife of everything that was going on. And verse 2 says, "Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah And we're going to see what she says, but before we get into what she says, um, we need to realize, and this is why I think it's so personal to me and I think personal to everybody. And I'm going to use man as a generic term, because even the best of men are still men at their best. We're just mere men. And one of the things I like about reading this text is Elijah was no different than us. He was no different. Yes, he was empowered by God to do some amazing things. So were we. But he was just somebody who was giving everything he had out to God. And everything that he possibly could give. So most of the people that was with him, remember in Mount Carmel, choose this, who you're going to serve, who's it going to be, stop playing the games. After God showed who he was in burning on the altar, then they all agreed. But he's no longer there. So he's here in this town, he's here in this area, and he's a man doing what he can do. And the thing about that is, if you go back really quickly and see some of the examples in the biblical studies, whenever a person was used by God to do something absolutely phenomenal, what happened next? They were tried and tested. Christ himself, we studied it in the Mark. Baptism, what happened immediately after the baptism? Satan took him to the wilderness to tempt them. David tempted many times. Abraham was a pretty solid guy, man. He was a good guy until he went down and told the king that his wife was his sister because he was afraid to get killed. All of these men of God have come to a moment where they showed they were just the best of men, but men at the best. And so we need to realize that sometimes we put these biblical characters and prophets up on these pedestals like, man, I could never be like that. I could never live a life like that. God could never use me like that. Yeah, he can. It doesn't matter who we are and how we're put together. God knows how we're put together, and he won't call us into something that we can't do. He'll equip us and give us what we need. And so realizing where he's at a point right now. Ahab tells Jezebel. Jezebel now is going to give a message to him. But, David and Goliath. How did Goliath fall? Why did David go up to this man of Goliath, the beast, and have no fear? It's because he wasn't looking at Goliath. He was looking at his God. How did Peter walk on water? Because he's had his eyes focused on God. As soon as he looked down, what happened? He went down. And so there's a very good mix of man at his best can only be his best depending on where his focus is. And so we have Elijah now, all that he just conquered, all that he just did, he's now here. So let's look at the message. Finish up verse 2. And this is the message. So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. So what does that mean? Well, interesting. So let the gods do to me. This is really, it's a fresh phrase, very new in the Old Testament. You hear a lot more of that phrase by other individuals throughout the New Testament. And the Old Testament and the New Testament, but here it's basically a signature. It's, I guarantee you I'm going to do this. Let the gods, and realize there was not God, it was gods. She believed in multiple gods. She looked at all of the false gods. It didn't matter whose God, what God, except for Christ, or except for the real God, Yahweh. She believed in all the rest of them. Let all of those gods do to me, or even worse, if you're not dead by tomorrow. What would you do? Jezebel had a reputation. She was someone who was not nice, someone who was not good. And so he begins to look at that and read that letter. And from that moment on, we find in verse 3, and when he saw that, he arose and ran for his life and went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servants there. Now, from where he was in Mount Carmel to Beersheba was about 70 to 80 miles. So he did not just run a little, he ran for his life. And he kept going and he kept going because why? Because Beersheba was one of the most populated towns or cities in the southern region. So he was going to where all the people were, hopefully that he would either hide in the crowd or get lost in the crowd, or he would be able to have some people to support him. He was running for his life. What happened to him that allowed him to be so courageous to King Ahab and mock the prophets of Baal, telling them they'll be, and then even going further, believing, widow, just give me first of the food and you and I will always eat. I mean, believing God from the moment he called him to do all these things. And we find the answer to that very quickly in verse 3. Because when we read verse 3, when she sent him, verse 2, she sent him the letter. Verse 3, and when he saw that, what did he do? He took his eyes off God, didn't he? He looked at the note. He looked at the words. He knew that she was going to back it up because as she said, so let the gods do to me. It's a guarantee you're going to be dead. And he knew she would follow through. He looked at the note. And he just forgot everything that he'd just been through. And to me, what that is when he just did some absolutely phenomenal things for God. And I've lived through it. Hope many of you, you're on fire for God, man. You're excited. You're doing things for God. And then all of a sudden, wham, something happens. And, when God wants to use us and he uses us well, we become a target after that. We become Satan's target. He roams around as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. So when we look at that and we understand that, listen, God's saying, listen, I want to use you, and I want to use you in a great way. And we're like, yeah, but I know what's coming after that. He got his eyes off of the God who just did amazing things in his life, and he began to look at the circumstance. And it's no different with us. When I am sure that when Peter looked at Christ and got out of that boat, he was a little nerved. But here's the thing about Peter. And for you and I, if you want to walk on water, you do need to get out of the boat. If you want to serve God, you do need to get out of your comfort zone. If you want to do great things for God, you need to stop looking at the circumstance. You want to understand true forgiveness of God? Then let whatever you have done be gone. You got to let God forgive and let God clean the slate. And you can't keep looking at the slate that's dirty because it's not. It's cleaned. And so when we understand this spiritual depression, spiritual depression happens when we get our eyes focused off of who he is. Elijah lost his focus. He lost his look. And so now he's running for his life, scared to death, not knowing what to do. And so how do we know that he really went to a point that basically went even further? Because once he left Beersheba, which belongs to Judah and his servants, verse 4 starts, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. So he took another journey, or further than that. Second thing, not only does getting our eyes off God bring us spiritual depression, but the next thing is we isolate ourselves. You could be in a crowd of 1,000 people and still be all alone. Been there, done that. So maybe some of you are experiencing that now. You can be there laughing and carrying on, but inside, there's nothing there. There's nothing left to give. You're gone. You're done. Elijah went off and isolated himself. Second thing that leads you to this spiritual depression. Listen, we got to be around God's people. Why? Because God's people should lead us back to God. When God's people just say, okay, you need to just do this. You need to just do this. That's wrong. That's bad counsel. When somebody comes to you and I and they're having issues or having problems in life, we need to sit down and say, well, listen, let's read this in the Bible. Let's read what God did for this person. Let's read what God was able to do to help this circumstance. Because when they start reading the Bible, listen, don't read it for them. One of the worst things we can do is read the Bible for somebody else. You need to turn that Bible right around. I've done it several times in my counseling at my desk. I said, well, I want us to read a verse. And they're like, okay. Now, oh, no. Whoosh, you read the verse. And it's amazing what the difference is. You know why? Because when they read it, it won't come back void. When they read it, it does something different to them. They're not hearing me. They're not hearing you. Who are they listening to at that moment? God. You see, we need to steer those back. That's why you can't isolate yourself. Elijah isolated himself. He went to this place. He went further than Beersheba. And then as he did isolate himself there, he had this powerful, godly man, solid prophet prayer. Look at the rest of verse 4. And he prayed that he might die and said, it is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers. Aren't you glad that God doesn't answer all our prayers the way we ask? You know, sometimes we break these prayers. You know, God, I'm just done. God, I can't come on the left. God, I'm done. And listen, there are many different reasons why we find ourselves in this situation. There are many things in our lives that are going to happen, had happened, going to happen, might happen, it may be happening, all those things added together. There are many things that allow us to come to a point where we're just, God, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. God, I got to give up. God, and that's exactly what he did. He was checking out. Why? Because he focused on the note. He didn't focus on his God. And that's what happens to you and I. That's what happens to us when we get to this point Elijah got to, when all that was going on, all that God did through his life, the whole nation of Israel, everybody there in Israel, the whole thing. In fact, you can go back to chapter 18, verse 38. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice and the wood and the stones and the dust, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. Now, when all the people saw it, they fell on their face, and they said, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. He created with God a national revival. And now he's praying to God to die. That's like major polar opposites, isn't it? And again, all because he focused on the note and he lost sight of his God. And I think we do that. I think Satan gets us to do that. We do that in our lives. We put that, I think, a lot of times in our life, because even in this physical fatigue that he was coming out of, even all that was going on, we find him here stuck in his place. And J.B. London did a study years ago, and I'm sure it's probably the same, maybe even worse now, but 90% of the full-time pastors in work said that they work more than 46 hours a week. 96 pastors said they don't feel adequate to fulfill all the needs of a ministry. 80% said that ministry is a negative note on their families. 33% said it is the most hazardous thing in my marriage. That's full-time ministry. It's not easy. It's not easy as God's children to be in the ministry mode. Listen, full-time ministries, I just get paid for it. Y'all do it as volunteers. We all should be full-time ministry people. We all should be serving God every day, and we saw that this morning. It's not a once-a-week ceremonial ritual. It's an everyday worshiping God. And when we do that every day, and we want to serve God, and God uses us in great ways, then all of a sudden Satan will come in and he'll put us into these places. life will put us into these places. Circumstances of life will get us here. We'll get into a spiritual depression, physical fatigue, and we isolate ourselves. When we isolate ourselves, man, we are a sitting duck for Satan. And he will take us down roads that you and I would never choose to go down. He will allow us to do things that we never, ever would have done any other way. And to me, I think it's a very serious problem within our churches today. Because our world is going at such a fast pace. We got to survive in it. We got to live in it. And yet to do full-time plus everything else that God has for us and wants us to do, we got to learn to blend them together. Whether we're employed or retired or whatever we're doing. I talked to enough of retired people that they wish they could go back to work to get a rest. The honey-do list is much harder than 8 hours of work, I'm telling you. But as we do our life is so busy. And you know, I'm that guy now that people fly by. People pass because they think I'm going too slow. And that's like, you know what? Just, why are you in a hurry to go nowhere? You know, you catch up with the light, they're still there. You catch here, they're still there. Elijah got to a point where he made this prayer. Interesting, and again, the words, first he's prayed that he might die. His words saying, it is enough. God, I'm done. And if you've ever been to that point, if you ever prayed that prayer, you know, maybe it's not something you've made known to everybody around, but circumstances brought you to the point where you're crying out to God. The next step is, Lord, take my life. And then he says, I am no better than my fathers. I am no better than the ones who turn their back on you, God. I'm no better. And I can't understand that phrase. I can't understand why he would say that at this moment. Whether it's because he's running, he's realizing that he's running from a queen instead of trusting God, and now he thinks he's failed as God. Whatever that statement was, it brought him to a point where he was completely checked out. Understanding all of that, understanding what God, was doing through his life at this time. Again, we know in verse 5, as we follow down through, as he sleeps under a broom tree, suddenly an angel touched him. And we're going to see that next week. We're going to pick that up next week, how that angel came and touched him. And, you know, God knows we're struggling. God knows we hurt. God allows us to go through those experiences, I believe, so that we can experience the touch of the hand of our God. So that we can experience that touch or that moment, that prayer, that song, that verse, that message, that friend, somebody coming into our life and just putting it right out there. And then all of a sudden, what happens? We start focusing back on our God. And I take very personal this text because been there, done that. Was at a place in my life one time that it just wasn't good. Wasn't good at all. And again, I still suffer some of the ripples from that years and years later of some of my actions and some of the things that I've done. And no, I wouldn't get bit by a snake because of them. Better clarify that. But some of the people I let down and some of the people that I abandoned at that time. And you know, when you see a man like Elijah do the same thing, it doesn't make it any easier, it doesn't make it any better. But what it does do is when you go back and see the problem, just took his eyes off God. And I realized in my life, if I would just do that and stay home, stay there, how much more? Christ says many times in the New Testament, if you abide in me and I abide in you, then ask what you want. If the abiding, and that Greek word abide means stay home. Stay home. If we stay home with our God, you know, we're going to get hit. We're going to hurt. We're going to go through things. But hopefully and prayerfully, we never get to this prayer. We never get to this prayer where you say, God, I'm just done. God, take my life. I'm done. Because there's so many more things that God could have done. So many more things God could have made a part of that. And so, looking at that, realizing, and again, it's a personal thing with me. And I don't know if some of you've heard the testimony. I'll give it to you real quickly. But I don't know, maybe some of you haven't heard this. Some of the Grief Share people have heard my testimony a little bit. Um, but I literally went for 1 week, got on my motorcycle, left church, gave me a sabbatical and all that kind of stuff. I abandoned my children at that time, and that's the worst, hardest thing in my life. I can still see my children's face in my rearview mirror of my motorcycle every day. Every day that picture's in my head. And as I left, and I got to a point, long story short, I got to a point where I had Ashley, who was living down in South Carolina, take me to Table Rock Mountain State Park. Went to Walmart, bought a tent. I said, don't come back and get me for 1 week, no matter what happens. She has a testimony of seeing me in her rearview mirror. That's pretty phenomenal. And I actually went up to the mountain, and I took a selfie through my phone, and I was standing on the edge of the mountain, and I was that far away from jumping. I almost killed myself. I almost committed suicide. And I felt the hand and the presence of God. And all I had running through my mind is, I have something better than this. There's something better than this. And I went back off the edge, waited way too long to walk down the mountain in the dark, didn't have a flashlight. Made it down there and spent the rest of the week with my Bible and a loaded 9mm beside me. I said, God, one of these are going to work at the end of the week. Because I prayed that prayer. God, I'm done. I prayed that exact prayer, and I was done. And I look back now, 18 years, 20 years later, look at everything I would have not experienced if I didn't get my mind focused back on my God. He brought me back. He brought it all back together. It was all God doing that. And that's why this text is so personal with me, because I did pray that prayer. And I was willing. The selfie was there on the phone, threw it back so the kids could see my last picture. And yeah, that was a tough time. But hey, God's good. God's great through all of that. And because we go through these times, that makes God all the more special. That makes it all the worth more serving him and what he does and who he is. So I encourage you. I mean, I know we all struggle. We all go through issues. We all have issues in our mind and our hearts. And there's nothing wrong with hurting. And that's this morning. We all need. We are needy people. Get real with God. Spill it out there. Pour it out on the table. God knows. When we come needy to God, listen, we'll walk away. We'll get that angel touch that we're going to see next week in verse 5. We'll get that angel touch. And I can't give you the words. I know the hand of God was holding me, and I felt the pressure of God right there that I've never felt before. And I pray I never feel it again like that. Because that means I went there again, and I guarantee you, I made a vow to my God, I will never go that low in my barrel again. I don't care what happens. I'll never go that low again. Because he walked me out of the darkest days of my life. And he's worth a whole lot more than me going back into them dark days. And that's what I mean. It's more than just, hey, it's words on a page. This is life. We need to be more open. We need to be more real. And we really need to humble ourselves before God and let him do some things. Let him change us. Let him fix us. Let him redo whatever it needs done. And I think, and again, I'll bring it real personal. I think we worry more about the people that we're going to walk by if we come to the altar. What are they going to think? What are they going to say? They already think I'm really good. Who cares? Who cares what they think? When you're coming to get things right with God, who cares what other people think? That's the important part. When we come that real, as we're going to see Elijah next week come, we come that real to God. Listen, you're going to walk away with that purpose. As we shared this morning, come with a need, walk away with a purpose. That's what God will do. It's what he's going to do for Elijah. It's what he did for me. It's what he'll do for all of us. He'll put that purpose back in our life. And who knows what God will do from that point. But I know he'll do some amazing, wonderful things. And I stand as a testimony of that and what God was able to do and to bring me out of and bring me back. And I thank him for it every day. And there are still some days that get me. There are still some days that put me back into that mindset of where I was in that dark journey. But I'll tell you, one of the greatest methods I have of playing it forward is the open opportunity that we have as a chaplain, and playing that forward and helping people out of their dark days. And it's just let the darkness of your days, when God brings you up out of them, be turned around and use your greatest tool of evangelism, because it'll do it. He'll work it. And he'll make that work in our lives. So I want to end on an encouraging note. Y'all looking like you're about ready to lose it here. Let's be encouraged with all that, because we serve an unbelievable, awesome, mighty God. As he worked in the Old Testament prophets, he is the same God today, yesterday, and forever. He is the same God that'll do the same for you and I. He'll pull us up. He'll work us. He'll make it happen in our lives. So just want to encourage you with that. And I know that there are many testimonies here tonight that we could give how God has done that with all our lives in different ways. But we need to continue to give him the praise. But let's go ahead and close in prayer. Father, we thank you. Thank you for the study tonight. Just thank you for Gary and the pictures and all the excitement to know that we can go to areas of our world even today and know that there are literal places. They're real. Sometimes we study the Word of God and we lose sight of the realness. And Father, I want to, even this morning, I would just want to bring back the real. Lord, we are best of men are simply men at their best, and that's not really ever good enough. And we know that with you, we can do what you ask us to do, as long as we keep our mind and our heart focused on you. God, there's some amazing things that you have in store. Lord, don't let us get it caught up in the what happens next or the target that we may become. Let us stay our minds and hearts focused on you.